Let's see how we can create functions without final number of our input variables. Variadic function is a function that accepts a variable numbers of arguments. When we don't know number of arguments we are passing to our function. Also, variadic argument must be the last input argument inside of our function. Slice isn't equal with variadic input argument. If we compare slice of integers with variadic argument of integers, those data types are not the same. So how we can create variadic argument inside of our function? In our function SumPrices we have one input argument. Alias for that argument is p and data type is variadic argument of float 64. Also, our function will return one output variable as data type float 64. Inside of our function, for our implementation, we will use for loop and the range function to iterate over our p variable. Here we will sum all values inside of our variadic argument, and then we will return value of our sum variable as our output. Let's create multiple calls of this function inside of our main function. We created new variables sum1 and sum2, and we initialize new calls from our SumPrices function. In first case, we can see that we have 4 different values as our input values. In second case, we have only 2. Variadic argument in first case received 4 values, and in second case received only 2 values. But for the both calls we called the same function. Now when we print our 2 variables, output will look like this. For our sum1 variable we sum 4 different elements, while for our sum2 variable we sum 2 elements. This is the case of the function in which we have only variadic argument. Let's now see how we can create function with multiple inputs, but our variadic argument must be the last input. We created a new function, calculate object area. In this function, for first input variable, we have data type string. Second, and in the same time last input is variadic argument of integers. Inside of our function, we created implementation depending on which value we have for our first variable as data type string. If value of that string is rectangle, then we will calculate our area with specific formula in which we must have 2 different values. If value of our string is square, we will calculate our area in another way, and for that formula we only need to have one specific value. When we calculate our area, we will return that value as output of our function. Let's now create 2 different calls of this function inside of our main function. In first case, we will have rectangle value for our string, which means that we need to pass 2 more integers after our string value. In second case, we have value square, which means that after our string value, we need to pass only 1 value. In final picture, we have 2 different calls for 2 different things with 2 totally different implementations, but from the same function. We want to know how we can create functions where we will execute multiple cycles of our specific functions inside of themselves. For this example, we created a new function, price each inform. As we can see, we have 3 input variables, but we don't have output. We want to call our function inside of our implementation, and from this function we are not expecting anything. This kind of functions we call recursive. So how we can call our function inside of our implementation? First, we will write name of our function, and then to same declaration of our function, we will pass three values. So now, when we enter our function, we will print values of our a, b, c variables. Then we will increase our b variable by 1. After that, we will multiply our c value by 2. And then we will pass new values of our a, b, c variables again to our declaration. So in this case, we will create something like infinity for loop, because our function is calling herself. So now the question is how we can stop our loop, because we don't want in this case that our function works as for infinity loop. Somewhere we must break this loop. We can specify our reserved word return on a specific place, or in specific case where we want to break our recursive function. That will look like this. On line 11, we have scenario in which we will break our recursive function. So in this case, if we start cycle in which value of our b variable is equal to 3, then we will execute our return function. So the next question is why we return nothing, because on line 12 we only have return declaration. Well, in this case, we just want to break our recursive function because this function doesn't have the output. What if we have case when we want to return specific value from our recursive function? Let's write that function. We have the same three inputs as we had in first function, but now we have output. That output will have data type string. When we call new cycle of our function inside of our function, we must specify reserved word return in front of our function. Only in that case we will create recursive function. How we can break this function? As you can see on line 19, we will do that exactly in the same way like we do for first function. Only now, because we have output, we won't just write return, and instead of that we will specify specific value which we want to return from our recursive function. Let's now execute these two functions inside of our main function. As we can see, our first call doesn't have output, so we passed values hello, 1 and 2, and below our call we can see the output. In second case, we specified values welcome, 3 and again 3. So in this case, we didn't print values on each new cycle, and instead of that, we only returned last state from our recursive function. Below our second call, we can see the output. Let's now see how we can call our function from our embedded structure. Inside of our admin structure, we wrote user. That user will be embedded structure with data type user. We want to create new function which will be connected to our user data type. We have a new question. If we create new object which will have data type admin with pointer, can we call our notify function from our admin object over our embedded structure user? Let's execute that implementation inside of our main function. We created a new object d1. How we can call our notify function from our d1 variable? We access our d1 variable, then we access our user structure inside of that object, and then that object will call notify function. Let's see one another thing. If our d1 variable immediately and directly call our notify function, we won't get an error. Instead of that, we will get the same output as we get on line 26. Because our user structure is embedded structure inside of our admin object, our language allows us that we can call directly all functions which are connected with all our embedded structures. So in this case, notify function is promoted. That's why we can access our d1 variable and then immediately, without calling our user structure, we can call our notify function and we won't get any error or any conflict. In the next video, we will see what is the difference between local and global variables and how we can call our function inside of if statement and inside of for loop.